Shalom, and welcome to the 6th episode of Life Lessons. We began with the book of Genesis, the book of Breshit. So we began with the story of creation, Adam and Eve, the 10 generations from Adam to Noah, the flood, Parshat Noach, and then we continue with the birth of Abraham, and that carried us through the 5 past lessons that carried the 5 sections of Breshit, Noach, Lech Lecha, Vayeirach HaYisrael, the life of Sarah. This is what we had the last time, the passing of Sarah. And now we're on to the 2nd generation of the patriarch, and this is the life of Yitzchok and Rivka. And Rebecca, Isaac and Rebecca. But before we're going to talk about them, because this is this week's section, Parshat Toldot, and in Genesis, these are the chapters that it's talking about it, beginning from chapter 25. So, an interesting parable. They say as follows. They say there was once a cow and a chicken walking together on the main street. And they saw a restaurant was advertising food. So it was advertising, it says steaks, $9.99, and it comes with an omelet. So the chicken turns to the cow, and it says, how exciting, you see how we contribute to society? I lay the eggs, and here they're advertising omelets, and from you, they get steaks. The cow turns to the chicken and says, yeah, you're very smart. In my case, it's a total commitment, because it's a total sacrifice. In the case of the chicken, it's just laying the eggs. So it's always brought out the idea of this parable is that our commitment has to be a total commitment, not just partial. And as we continue with the story here of the sages and the patriarchs, this point becomes very important. And let's dwell into the section here, and then we will understand what I mean by the total commitment in the part of Isaac. Besides that, we had the story that he was brought up on Mount Moriah as a sacrifice. It was almost a sacrifice, so no question in the mind of Isaac, he was ready for being a total commitment to the Almighty. There's even more than that. But a lot of times when we look just on the simple meaning of the stories and the lessons in the sections here of the Bible, in the 5 books of Moses, a lot of times when we look on the simple meaning, we could get a little bit misled by just the simple story. And when we come to the 2nd generation here of Isaac, a lot of times people ask the question, he's a nobody. What has he done? Abraham, so much is talked about him. He was the first one. God says to him, leave the country you were grown up to and go to Israel and to the country that I will show you. And all the tests that Abraham had. A life full of stories about Abraham. We come here, and if we look on the simple meaning, so the story in our sections here, yes, childless, she has twins, his wife, talks about the story of Jacob and Esau. But then, when you look a little bit more about Yitzchok, it says towards the end of his life, he's blind, the story with the blessing, he almost blessed the son that didn't deserve the blessing, and if not thanks to his wife, she really got it right and made sure that Jacob should be the one to get the blessing. So we could get the wrong interpretation here about who Isaac, or what we call him, who Yitzchok was. But really, our sages come and they explain it. And then when they explain it, and we look on the verses again, we really have an unbelievable lesson about the second generation. Because no question, when you grow up in a house of a great person, or you're the son, the child, or the daughter of a great person, and we know that from life many times, not necessarily the children were able to continue and to be as great as the parents. There is stories where the kids continued in the same footsteps of the parents and even did more. But a lot of times we find not necessarily when the parents are great parents and did so much. So a lot of times it gets lost by the children. It was too much pressure, too much to continue the same idea. And we see that. So we would think that maybe such a thing would have happened here. Like they tell us, for example, that Moses had children. However, they were not great enough to be able to continue his legacy. And the one that took over was Joshua, because he really was a good student of Moses and was able to become the leader. It says about, so we see that we have in our history here with Moses. So it seemed maybe that by Isaac would almost be the same thing. He's trying to continue the tradition and what he was learned from his parents, from Abraham and Sarah. He did go through a struggle. There was another brother, Ishmael, and he had to prove himself. He was brought up as a sacrifice, and then he was brought down. So no question he had challenges. However, it seems like that in the looking again on the verses here, that what separates him and what significance, what happened to Isaac where he stands different than Abraham. So I want to point out to something very interesting in the Torah. But before that, the Talmud tells us that later on in life, when it says about the great patriarchs, when they pray for their children from heaven that they should succeed, and we know that we went through so many tragedies. There was a temple that was destroyed, and there was a second temple. We always await for the third temple to be built. So there's a verse that says that they will tell Isaac, you are our father. It's an interesting verse in Isaiah chapter 63 verse 16 that it says, Abraham we do not know, and Israel, that means Jacob, we do not recognize. You are our father, we turn to God, our Redeemer. And somehow we learn, our sages tell us, that when it came to Isaac, somehow they were able to more associate more with Isaac. Some want to say, being the second generation, feeling all the challenges. So we identify a lot of times the pressure that Isaac had. But there's more than that. In other words, when it comes in times of trouble, here is Isaac, Yitzchok, the one that begs the Almighty for mercy for his children. Why is it? So we go to the portion of Parshat Toldot, that this is the sixth section in the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. Something stands out here about the story of Yitzchok. First of all, something important to notice, because many things that had happened to the father happened to the son. Abraham arrived to Israel, there was right away a hunger. Same thing is here. the verse says there was a hunger in the land in the times of Isaac. But here's something very interesting where it stands out different than Abraham. Abraham goes and he goes to Egypt. He leaves Israel and he goes to Egypt. He comes back later. By Isaac, the verse says, God appeared to him and he said to him, do not go down to Egypt. Stay here. Stay in this land. What is known, you are a holy offering. You are a sacrifice. And therefore, stay where you are. And I will fulfill all the promises that I promised to Abraham, I will fulfill with you. However, point number one is stay where you are. We find here a very important difference. Abraham, it says, Avram, as we would say, traveled. Not necessarily he stayed in one place. By Yitzchok, we find he stayed in one place. The difference is as follows. They both carrying the message of spreading the one God and what is expected from us to do. But Abraham felt, I live in a situation that not too many people, as we explained many times, know about this God. It's a new phenomenon. Till Abraham arrived, the world till then got used to away from believing God. They believed in pagans and idols and other things. To believe in one God, that was something new. So here comes Abraham on the scene and says, I discovered something special. I researched, I worked hard on it, and I'm telling you people, there is a creator to this world. Like imagine in 2014 that we find ourselves now, we have somebody getting up and say, listen fellows, there is a God in this world. And we all go, really? We didn't know that. But in the times of Abraham, he is the first one to announce this. The first one to announce this, he couldn't stay in one place. Okay, I'm going to stand in my synagogue or in my house of worship and I will preach from there and hopefully Channel 15 will arrive and will tape me. With Abraham, it's not necessarily going to work that way. He knew he needs to go out there and spread the message. So he traveled. He went from place to place to tell people. And he was successful. He was able to gather people around him. As we're soon going to explain more in detail. Now comes Isaac. And Isaac says, after the success of my father of spreading the message, now I have to define it. And to define it, I have to stay in one place. So it's like almost a teamwork here. You have the father or the CEO of the company that is trying to start this company so he becomes himself the agent of the company and is traveling all around. What is the purpose of this company? Spreading the one God. And God is good, and therefore you should serve him. Isaac sees that and sees that success, but now is to maintain that message. To maintain that message, you need to make sure that it gets to the right places. First, you want everyone to know about it. So you're advertising, you're telling everyone. So people are calling. You advertise an 800 number. You're going to get for free who knows what. People are calling. Now you are listening and you are deciding with whom am I going to associate? Who is getting the message and who is not yet ready to get the message? So Isaac feels to be able to deliver now the message, it's very important now for the second generation that this is him, to concentrate, to stay in one place, to take it apart before we continue. And that is where the importance of Isaac becomes here. I'm going to soon go back to explain it, but I want to point out in the verses a very important story that happened that brings out the point. The verse says as follows in chapter 26. It says, the man grew, prospered, and he continued to prosper until he became extremely wealthy. And that means not only physically, materialistically, but spiritually. And as the verse continues, says, so obviously there was jealousy, and the Philistines envied him. But here comes an interjection here, and it tells us that all the wells that the servant of his father had dug in the time of his father, as we know, water is a very important source of living, so they needed that in Israel, where they lived. So they used to, you dig a well to get the water. So it says all the wells that his servants of his father did, guess what? Sitmum Pelishtim, the Philistine had covered them up. They blocked up all the wells that his father's servant had dug in the days of his father Abraham, and they filled them up with earth. Why is it important to tell us this part of this story? Is because of what happens later. The verse continues and says, what did Yitzchok do? And seems like if we want to define, what did he do? So this verse 18, was interesting as a symbol to it in Hebrew, Chai 18, says, he redug the wells of water that has been dug in the days of his father, which was blocked up after his father's death. And he called them the same names that his father called them. And they continued digging for new ones. The first one, there was a fight on it between the shepherds of Avimelech, the king Avimelech. Then there was a second one, another fight. Finally, the third one, they didn't fight. And he called it Rechavot, open spaces. Now God has granted us ample space to expand, and we shall flourish in this land. Let's understand a little bit, spiritually speaking, what's going on here with this idea of the digging. So we see in the story, when Abraham dug the wells, he didn't last for a long time. They covered them up. The only way it lasted, it had to be uncovered again. By who? By Yitzchok. In Kabbalah, they tell us, as I mentioned before, that Yitzchok and Abraham were a team. So Abraham represents the idea of kindness, but Yitzchok represents the idea of gevura, that means restriction. A lot of times when we hear the word restriction, we think to us maybe that's a negative word, but not necessarily. To be able to get, for example, water in the right location, you may have to restrict. And the same thing is we know in our body, if God forbid there will be a flow of too much blood or any of these vital organs that we have, then it's not good. It needs to be restricted to what we need. So each one of us need to have what we need. If a person, for example, is going to sit and eat non-stop, we know what kind of problem we have here. But it's food. What's wrong with having food? Yes, sustenance is very important, but you have to limit, restrict to what you have. And we know also, unfortunately, a lot of times also, if, for example, we're going to give somebody more than what they need, sometimes it could hurt than help. To open up the pocket and start giving to everyone and without any restriction how and what, you're not helping the situation. You're making things worse. Spiritually speaking, this becomes very important too. Kindness is step number one. It represents the idea of giving. Giving is a very important principle and is a very important foundation that each one of us human beings have to have. And that's very important. However, after I have established myself as a person of giving, now kicks in restriction. In other words, not first restriction and then giving. First is giving, because you position yourself that from the point of view of being good, being nice, I'm going to give. And this is God. God is giving and He's wonderful. But then comes the idea of restriction. And this was represented by these two wonderful people, father and son, Abraham and Isaac, Abraham and Yitzchok. So Abraham is known as the kind person. He hears that Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be destroyed, as we spoke earlier on. He goes and he has a discussion with God about this. Because his idea is maybe there's some hope there. And he's willing to help anyone out there. So that's why he's represented by the idea of traveling. He's all over the place because he wants to help anybody there. Open house. He had in the desert, a tent, 4 entrances from all corners of the world. Anybody, everyone is invited. This represents the idea of uncovering the water. The water represents the holiness, sustenance, the good. It's hidden, it's covered. People don't know about it. He goes and he uncovers it. Dug the well. But here comes something, what happened over here. Because it is to everybody and no restrictions whatsoever, what happens sometimes is that after the excitement, after the message is gone, you forget about it and you go back to your ways. So you listened, for example, to a great speaker. For a few minutes he got inspired. After a while, if you didn't do anything concrete about it, the inspiration is gone and the excitement is gone. So what happened is with the Philistine here, for example, is they covered up those wells because Abraham was gone, so the excitement of his message was gone. Now the son, Isaac, has an unbelievable task in front of him. He needs to continue his father's message, but he wants to see that that message has a lasting message, that it continues. That not just we make announcements all over that there is a God. This was very important as step number 1. But now we want to have the full commitment. Till now, maybe we were satisfying ourselves just with an omelet. Now we want more than that. Now we want a total commitment. And therefore, even those wells that were covered up, Isaac is going to reopen them. He's going to reopen all those wells that were covered up. But the way that he's going to be successful is by refining the message and therefore he is restriction. But the point of restriction is to help the situation, is to help the message. And this becomes the very important part of Yitzchok. That is the contrast of what we say chesed, kindness, and gevura, severity and restriction, that it is represented by these two great giants, Avram and Yitzchok. What we're going to find very interesting later on is when it comes to the third generation, Jacob, he was a combination of both. He saw what Abraham has accomplished, giving the message, regardless, you just put out the message out there. Step number one. Then came the second generation and says, wait a second, I want this message to last. Let me restrict that. And then comes the third generation, and is a combination of the two, giving and restricting both together, as we're going to concentrate on it when we come to the next lessons. But right now, what's important to understand here of this story is, and this is what's important to us all the time, step number one is, I concentrate in the belief in my relationship with God. So step number one is God is unbelievable, and he's benevolent, and he's doing wonderful thing, and this is what we have to do. At the same time comes now the second point, is that therefore, just to scream and yell, I love God, without any concrete message to it, then the message gets lost. So I could yell and scream. If I tell it to, for example, a spouse says to each other, I love you, but nothing concrete with it, just words by itself, it means nothing. So therefore the action is very important, and sometimes the actions are very restrictive. So therefore that is the message that we have here. We got the message, then comes Isaac, reopens the well. Why? Because we direct it in the right way where it needs to go. May God help us that we should be able, each one of us, to find our right place and our right attitude, how we should be able to serve the Almighty. Thank you all.